We have actually had this happen. We had no idea a quote-unquote guest was even staying at our unit until we went in for inspections. This was one of the 2-bedroom units where there was only one tenant or occupant on the lease. So Jim's going through, and he gets to the closet in the 2nd bedroom, where we always move hanging clothes over to look for mold. Well, when he opens it, it's chock full of women's clothes and shoes and handbags. He comes up to us and he asks, "Did the male tenant get a roommate?" And we said, "No. Why?" Well, he walks us to the closet to show us, and we were floored. Obviously, someone else was living there. And that's exactly why your guest policy matters, because without one, you may not even know that it's happening. And by the time you find out, that guest may have legal rights you weren't expecting. And that's what we're covering in today's episode. Welcome to Your Landlord Resource podcast. Many moons ago, when I started as a landlord, I was as green as it gets. I may have had my real estate license, but I lacked confidence and the hands-on experience needed when it came to dealing with tenants, leases, maintenance, and bookkeeping. After many failed attempts, fast forward to today, Kevin and I have doubled our doors and created an organized, professionally operated rental property business. Want to go from overwhelmed to confident? If you're an ambitious landlord or maybe one in the making, join us as we provide strategies and teach actionable steps to help you reach your goals and the lifestyle you desire, all while building a streamlined and profitable rental property business. This is Your Landlord Resource podcast. Hey, landlords. Welcome back to the Your Landlord Resource podcast. I'm your host, Stacy, and I'm here with my husband and my co-host, Kevin.
Hey, everyone. Happy to be here today.
So today's episode is a topic that is one that we really didn't consider much of an issue until it became an issue and we had to deal with it.
Yep, and that would be your guest policy.
Yep, your guest policy. The thing that could save your property from an unauthorized occupant situation, or at the very least, save you from a very awkward conversation you were not prepared to have with your tenant, which, by the way, is a situation that happens more than landlords realize. And it usually starts super innocently. You know, like my cousin is just staying for a couple weeks, and then suddenly it's 6 months later and the cousin has a key and is collecting mail at your property and has a dog that you definitely did not approve.
Yeah, that's all true. I mean, it can really escalate quickly. So today we're going to walk you through what a guest policy actually is, how you build one that fits your property, what it covers, what it doesn't, and what happens when a guest crosses the line and becomes an unauthorized tenant. There's a lot here that protects you, so let's jump right in. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Stace, why don't you let the listeners know what exactly is a guest policy?
Okay, well, at its most basic, a guest policy is a clause in your lease agreement, or sometimes it's a completely separate signed addendum, and it defines who counts as a guest versus a tenant. It sets limits on how long a guest can stay, and it spells out the consequences if those rules are violated. And the reason this matters so much is that under the law, a guest who sticks around long enough can actually start to acquire legal rights as a tenant, which means you can't just ask them to leave. You have to go through a formal eviction process, which is costly, time-consuming, and very stressful. And nobody wants that. So the guest policy is really your first line of defense. It protects your property, it protects your tenant, and it keeps expectations crystal clear from day one. And notice that I said it protects the tenant too, because here's the thing that people don't realize. The tenant on the lease is fully responsible for whatever their guests do. Any damage or noise complaints, any lease violations, that's on your tenant.
So having a clear guest policy actually helps the tenant understand their own exposure. If their guest breaks something or causes a problem, the landlord is coming to them, not the guest, because the guest signed nothing. The guest has zero accountability on paper. which is exactly why we want every adult who is actually living at the property to be on the lease.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, one important disclaimer before we go any further. Guest policies, those laws vary by state. What triggers tenant status in California may be completely different from what triggers it in Idaho. And trust me, as someone who has rentals in both states, that difference is real. For instance, in Idaho, landlords have broad discretion to set guest limits in a lease. Idaho generally gives landlords more flexibility with shorter notice periods, and in certain instances, as little as 3 days. This differs significantly from California, where strict tenant-friendly laws dictate guest status, and landlords must navigate lengthy formal eviction processes to remove unauthorized residents. So please, use this episode as your framework, but consult a local real estate attorney when you're actually drafting or updating your lease. Don't just copy something that you found online and call it a day. Now, if you use state-specific leases generated from a software like Easy Landlord Forms or Turbo Tenant, you're probably okay. It's when you type your own statement into the lease, those should be verified.
Good point. The ones generated from that software are reviewed by their legal team and should be fine. But we do suggest that no matter where you generate your lease from, have it reviewed by a real estate attorney in the state of the rental property to verify all is well. Okay, so let's talk about how a guest policy is structured, because it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. The type of rental property you have actually affects what your guest policy needs to look like. The two main categories here are single-family rentals versus multi-unit properties, and there are some meaningful differences between the two. So for single-family homes, that would be a standalone house, a condo you rent out, that kind of thing. The guest policy tends to be a little simpler. You've got one household, one tenant relationship, and the main concerns are duration of stay and preventing unauthorized use of the property.
Like someone subletting the place on Airbnb while they're on vacation.
Exactly. Which does happen. And without a guest policy that explicitly prohibits short-term rentals, you might not have much recourse. So even for a single-family rental, you want that language in there.
Yeah, for sure. Now, for multi-unit properties, so that would be duplexes, triplexes, quads, fourplexes, apartment buildings, the guest policy becomes even more critical because now you've got multiple tenants whose quality of life can be directly affected by what's happening in another unit. A guest issue in one unit can very quickly become everyone's problem. Noise, parking, shared laundry facilities, it all can have that ripple effect. And this is also where HOA communities add another layer. If you own a condo or a property in a planned community, the HOA may have its own rules about overnight guests. Things like parking restrictions or requirements to register guests in advance. We have this with the fourplex in Idaho. Even us as owners, we have had our rental car get a boot on it when we were working there late at night because the license plate was not registered with a security company that comes around.
Yeah. I mean, that was so much fun dealing with that. And that was after working a 17-hour day on the units. Okay. So now you've got your lease and the HOA rules. Both matter, you guys. So if you're in an HOA, make sure your lease guest policy doesn't conflict with the HOA rules. And once again, if you're not sure, that's a great question for your attorney. Another piece of this that's tied to the property type is your occupancy limits.
Yep. And this is the foundation everything else is built on. Your occupancy limit defines the maximum number of people who can legally reside in a unit. Most housing codes use a general standard of 2 people per bedroom plus 1. But local laws can be stricter or more flexible depending on where you are. And let me be clear, this is separate from the number of guests allowed to visit. Occupancy limits are about permanent residents. But occupancy limits set the ceiling on the max number of people allowed to be in a rental property. Your guest policy then operates within that ceiling. And beyond what local law requires, landlords can also set their own parameters based on unit size and floor plan, as long as you're not violating fair housing laws.
Which is an important note. You can't set different occupancy limits for different tenants based on protected class. Your policy has to be applied consistently.
Yeah, consistently and in writing. Always in writing. So, quick sideline here. Setting up your policies is part of your standard operating procedures. Those policies should be written out and available to all tenants, not only in your lease, but in your unit binders or on your rental property webpage if you happen to have one. We did an episode all about standard operating procedures. I believe it was episode 6. We will link that in the show notes for you guys to check that out if you haven't listened to it yet. All right, so let's get into the actual nuts and bolts of what a guest policy should include. There are 4 components every landlord should have. The first one is duration of stay, and this is a big one. Most leases limit guests to somewhere between 10 and 14 consecutive nights, or a maximum of 14 to 30 total days within any 6-month period, without prior approval from the landlord. And the consecutive nights piece is crucial because someone can get, really cute and technically leave for a day just to reset the clock if you're only tracking total nights.
Which is exactly why you want both, consecutive and total. Cover both of those points. What do we do again? I believe it's 7 consecutive nights and no more than 21 days in a calendar year.
Yeah, 7 consecutive days, no more than 21. That is our policy. If someone needs more time, they generally will email us asking for permission to extend it. Now, the second thing is occupancy limits. We talked about that just a minute ago. But it belongs in the guest policy too. Your lease should state the maximum number of occupants and tie that to the guest policy so it's clear that a long-term guest could push that tenant into a violation.
Right. So you guys think about a single family home with, say, 2 bedrooms. But the family renting it has mom, dad, grandma, and 2 kids. In most states, you're already at your occupancy limit. If they have someone come to visit and something like a house fire happens, when the fire department and police show up, they will be evaluating how many people were living or staying there. If you are over your occupancy limit and don't know about it, you may get in trouble for that. So beware of the occupancy limits when you set your guest policy. Okay, the third component of a guest policy is tenant liability. Your policy should be crystal clear that the tenant is fully responsible for the behavior of their guests. Property damage, noise violations, lease violations. The tenant is on the hook for all of that. Because again, the guests sign nothing. This is why we stress the importance of requiring renter's insurance. If that house fire I was just talking about was caused because the guest was cooking something or grilling or whatever, and it caused a fire, that renter's insurance may cover the liability for the damages caused. And the fourth one, subletting and short-term rental prohibition. This one has become more important in the last several years as platforms like Airbnb and Vrbo have made it incredibly easy for tenants to quietly sublet your property without telling you. You want an explicit clause that bans short-term rentals and unauthorized subletting. No renting the whole property while they go on vacation. No renting a spare bedroom to someone for extra cash.
And if they violate that, that's a lease violation. And depending on your state, it can be grounds for termination of the lease. So there's actually one more element, a fifth thing I'd add, which is a little more nuanced. And that's who exactly counts as a guest that needs to be disclosed or authorized. Most of the time, regular friends and family visiting for a few days, that's no problem, right? But what about a parent who moves in because they're aging and they need help? Or a live-in nanny or an au pair? Those situations are different. Those are not casual visits. And your policy can and should address those scenarios by requiring written approval from the landlord for any extended or semi-permanent stay by a non-lease occupant, even if it's family. Actually, especially if it's family, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, especially family. Families can be complicated. I think we all know this. All right, this is the part of the episode where landlords really need to lean in because this is where the real risk is. This is the oh no moment if you don't have your policy in place. So, when does a guest legally cross over into tenant territory? The most common standard you'll see in leases and in court decisions is that a guest who stays more than 14 consecutive nights or more than 30 total nights in a 6-month period is considered a resident. And once someone has resident status, they may have legal rights, which means you can't just knock on the door and tell them to leave. At that point, you're looking at formal legal notices and potentially the eviction process, which is a whole different situation.
And the state law really matters here because different states have very different thresholds for when a guest becomes a tenant. And it's not just time. Courts and landlords look at other factors too. Does the guest have a key? Are they receiving mail at the property? Have they moved some of their own furniture in? And are they paying any of the bills?
Or rent.
Right. Which brings me to one of the most important things that we want you to hear in this episode. Do not accept rent from a guest. Ever. Not even once. Even one payment could inadvertently establish a landlord-tenant relationship with someone who was never screened, never background checked, and is not on your lease.
You guys, that is a big deal. Do not do it.
If a guest has been staying long enough that you think that they should be contributing to rent, that's your sign that they need to be formally added to the lease. Not that you should start quietly collecting money for them.
So, what do you actually do when you've identified that someone has crossed that line from guest to unauthorized occupant?
Funny you should ask, because we have actually had this happen. We had no idea a quote-unquote guest was even staying at our unit until we went in for inspections. And of course, we notified them to let them know that we were going in. We give at least a week, usually 2 weeks notice before the inspection day. This was one of the 2-bedroom units where there was only one tenant or occupant on the lease. So Jim's going through, checking that all the windows open and there's no mildew issues. And he gets to the closet in the 2nd bedroom, where we always move hanging clothes over to look for mold. No air circulation in closets and behind dressers can cause mold if they're on an outside wall. Well, when he opens it, it's chock full of women's clothes and shoes and handbags. So he finishes his part of the walkthrough, and he comes up to us and he asks, "Did the male tenant get a roommate?" And we said, "No. Why?" Well, he walks us to the closet to show us, and we were floored. Obviously, someone else was living there. Then when we checked the spare bath, sure enough, there was a bunch of care products that most men don't use or need. So we took pictures of all of it, and then later I sent out an email noting all that we had done and the findings with the photos. And he came back and he said, "Oh yeah, a friend from college just started a job and couldn't find a place she liked. So I let her stay with me for a while. Sorry, I should have let you know." Well, unfortunately for him, now that we did know, we had to remind him of the guest policy, which they clearly had gone over, and tell him she either has to leave or go on the lease. And actually, they opted to have her join the lease for a year.
Yeah, and you guys, I know it sounds like it was bad, but it actually went rather smoothly. She moved out after the lease expired. And the thing is, now that he knew we would not turn a blind eye to what he was doing, he has been very upfront about guests or problems or letting us know when he will be out of town for an extended period of time. Your tenants need to know that you're paying attention to the rental. You may not have to be in the unit every other month, but just driving by and noticing an unfamiliar car in the driveway for a few days is grounds to inquire. Talk to your tenants. Before you go nuclear, have the conversation. A lot of landlords skip this and jump straight to legal notices, but a direct, professional conversation often resolves it. Your tenants may not fully understand the rules, or they may not realize how long the situation has gone on. And if the conversation goes well, the solution is to add that person to the lease. They go through the standard screening process, background check, credit check, income verification, same as any other applicant. You may also have grounds to adjust the rent.
And if the conversation does not go well, or the situation doesn't get resolved, then yes, you move to a formal lease violation notice. And depending on how serious it is, that could escalate from there. But what you cannot do, and this is really important, you cannot change the locks. You cannot shut off utilities. You cannot remove their belongings, even if the person has no legal right to be there. You still have to follow the legal process. In California, for example, that means serving a proper notice, like a 3-day notice to perform or quit, before you can take any further steps. But always start with a nice, respectful conversation.
And if it doesn't go well, that's where a good real estate attorney really earns their fee.
Yeah, and actually, this is a really good moment to mention episode 125, because it ties directly to this conversation.
And I believe what you're referring to is the one when your tenant's child turns 18.
Yep, because here's a scenario that a lot of landlords don't think about. Your tenant moves in with their 16-year-old. Fine, no problem. That kid turns 18, now they're a legal adult. And if they're still living in the unit, they are technically an adult occupant who is not on your lease, which is essentially the same situation as an unauthorized long-term guest. So if you want to hear more about how to handle that specific situation, what your rights are, what your obligations are, and how to approach that conversation with your tenant, check out episode 125. We cover it in depth. You can find it at yourlandlordresource.com/episode 125.
All right, we want to take a quick minute to talk about a few tools that can actually make building and managing your guest policy a lot easier. Because knowing what to do is one thing, having the right systems in place is another. First up, Easy Landlord Forms. This is a great resource if you want professionally drafted, state-specific lease templates and addendums. A solid guest policy addendum needs to be legally sound for your state, and Easy Landlord Forms is built around exactly that. Customizable documents that are state-specific, and get this, they're actually readable, which is not something you can say about every legal template out there. This is what you use for Kid 2 and his leases for his duplex, right?
Yes, it is. And I'll say that the body of the lease is pretty solid. The thing that I like about it is that it gives you areas where you can add or expand upon information in that lease. And like the guest policy addendum, they have over 25 addendums that you can add to your lease to make it even more complete. Now, if you have not listened to our last episode about how landlords can use AI to help them with their rental property business, I really suggest you give it a full listen. One thing I did with his lease this last time was upload it to AI for a quick review. And AI came back with well over 10 things that were good, but not clearly written. So I went back and I made some changes with the advice of AI. But I want to be clear here. Using a state-specific lease from Easy Landlord Forms and then running it through AI for a once-over is all good stuff. But we highly recommend that you ask your real estate attorney to review the lease before sending it out to your tenant for their review. And with all that said, we will link Easy Landlord Forms and Turbo Tenant in the show notes for you.
I haven't used Easy Landlord Forms yet. For us being realtors here in California, we have access to pretty good leases. Plus, we use the leases from the California Department Association too. But wherever you get your leases, have an attorney do a once-over on them. Okay, the next software we recommend is Turbo Tenant. You've heard us mention them a ton on this podcast, and if you're not using Turbo Tenant yet, this is one of our favorite platforms for new self-managing landlords. They have everything you need to manage your leases, screen tenants, and collect rent all in one spot. And relevant to today's episode, when a long-term guest needs to be added to the lease, Tenant makes running that background and credit check quick and easy, because that person should go through the exact same process as your original applicant. You can also use Tenant to set up your lease addendums digitally, which means your guest policy can be signed electronically right alongside your lease. No chasing people down for signatures. You can check them out using the link in our show notes. We do earn a small commission if you sign up, which helps support the show. And something to note is, we only recommend tools we actually believe in.
Correct. If we do not actually use or have detailed knowledge about a product, we generally are not going to recommend it. And listen, we have had offers to make money off a lot of things that do not align with our business or our goals. We do not push products that we do not truly believe will work for you. Which leads me to our last recommendation. And I want to take a minute and talk about DoorLoop, because this one is worth highlighting for landlords who are managing multiple units or want to take their operation to the next level. DoorLoop is a full property management platform with lease management, tenant screening, rent collection, maintenance tracking, and accounting, all in one place. And what I love specifically for today's conversation is this. When a guest situation escalates and that person needs to be formally added as a tenant, DoorLoop lets you run a full credit, criminal, and eviction check through their built-in TransUnion SmartMove integration right inside the platform.
And SmartMove is one of the screening softwares we highly recommend you use. So it's really nice the DoorLoop is already integrated with them.
Yeah, exactly. There's no jumping back and forth between software. You screen them, you update the lease, you get the e-signature, and your records are all in one place, which, if you ever need to prove what happened and when, this feature is incredibly valuable. DoorLoop also stores all your lease documents and addendums, which means your guest policy is always easy to find. It's not in a file drawer somewhere, not in an email that you sent a year ago. It's right there attached to the lease.
And for anyone who wants to try it, DoorLoop offers a free demo, and we will link that in the show notes. If you sign up for the paid plan through our link, we do earn a commission, but we genuinely think this platform is worth looking at, especially if you're growing your portfolio. The links for all of those we just mentioned are in the show notes, as always.
All right, so let's close up this episode. Guest policies. They're not the most glamorous part of being a landlord. Nobody gets excited about lease addendums.
Well, some people do.
Kevin.
What? Lease addendums are fascinating.
They are not fascinating. They're important. And the point of today is that a well-written guest policy is one of the quietest but most powerful tools that you have as a landlord. It defines expectations before problems start. It protects you from unauthorized occupants, and it keeps your tenant relationship professional and clear.
And if you take nothing else from this episode, review your current lease. Does it have a guest policy? Does it have time limits, both consecutive and total? Does it prohibit subletting? And does it address tenant liability for guest behavior?
Yeah, that's very important. And if the answer to any of those is no, it's time for an update. Maybe use the links in the show notes to check out Easy Landlord Forums, Tenant, and DoorLoop. Those are great places to start if you need to redo something.
And as always, please consult a real estate attorney for anything state-specific. We are not attorneys. We are landlords who have learned a lot the hard way, and we want to help you skip some of those lessons.
Which is exactly what this podcast is for. So if you found this episode useful, would you do us a favor and share it with just one other landlord? Because word of mouth is how we grow, and we would really appreciate it.
And if you haven't already, please leave us a good rating or kind review wherever you listen. You may not think it's a big deal, but it does genuinely help our little podcast grow.
Yeah, you can find all the links mentioned here today and many more, including how to get in contact with us. Those are all in the show notes, or you can find them at yourlandlordresource.com/episode 130.
All right. That's a wrap on this one.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. And until next time, you've got this, landlords.